Okay, as we look at problem number 1 on your Chapter 2 review, the directions say find the slope of the line passing through the pair of points, or state that the slope is undefined. So you'll notice that they give you those two pair of points. The pair of points that they give you is -8, -9, 8, -1. So you'll need to remember your slope formula. So remember your slope formula is m equals y sub 2 minus y sub 1 all over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. So you just need to remember that this would be your x sub 1, this would be your y sub 1, and then this would be your x sub 2, and this is your y sub 2. So this is just a matter of substituting in those numbers into your equation and then just solving it. So when we substitute those numbers in, so notice that here I have my y sub 2, which is equal to -1. I'm going to minus my y sub 1, which is -9. And then I've got 8 for my x sub 2, subtract my x sub 1, which is -8. So remember, this comes out to be -1. A minus makes that a plus 9. And then I've got 8 minus a minus 8 is going to be plus 8. So that's 8 plus 8. So simplifying that down, I get -1 plus 9, which gives me that positive 8. I've got that 8 plus 8, which gives you that positive 16. So you got 8 over 16. Now go ahead and reduce that down, dividing both top and bottom by 8. And it simplifies down to your slope is equal to 1/2. And that would be your answer to problem number 1, and that looks like that matches the answer of C. Okay, looking at your second problem on your review, it says that on number 2, it says use the given condition to write an equation for the line. Your slope is equal to 3. It's passing through the points 5 and 6. So to write an equation of a line, you can use either this first equation, which is called point slope form. You can use y minus y sub 1 equals m times x minus x sub 1. Or you can use your second equation of y equals mx plus b. So they're both just a matter of substitution. So notice in place of y sub 1, so here's my y sub 1, which is 6. So I'm going to go ahead and place that right here in place of y sub 1. So that becomes a 6. It says my slope is 3. So here's my slope. Here's my x sub 1 over here, which is 5. So substituting in that 5. So I get the equation y minus 6 all equals 3 times x minus 5. And so to simplify that one down, all it is just a matter of distribution. So you're going to use your distributive property. So we're going to go ahead and distribute or 3 on through. So when I distribute this 3, I get 3x. When I get 3 times -5 is going to be -15. And now my last step is to bring the 6 over to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and add 6 to both sides. And when I do that, I end up with my answer of y equals 3x minus 9. So that is using the equation y minus y sub 1 equals m times x minus x sub 1. Now if you want to use your other equation that we used last year, you can use the y equals mx plus b. It's still just a matter of substitution. So substituting in your values. So notice here is my y value. So it's going to go in place of y here. So I substitute it in. I get 6. And then here's my x value. And that's going to go in place of my x, which is 5. And then here's my slope, which is 3. I'm going to substitute that in place of my m in my equation. And so that becomes 3. So that's going to make it so that I can figure out what my b is, or my y-intercept. So solving for b is what I need to find. So solving this equation, I'm going to take 3 times 5. I'm going to take 3 times 5, I get 15. So now I have 6 equals 15 plus b. So now I need to go ahead and subtract 15 from both sides. So subtracting 15 from both sides, I end up with my y-intercept of -9. Okay, now that I know that my y-intercept is equal to -9, it's just a matter again of substitution. So here is my slope, which is 3, and you'll notice that up here it said that I had a slope of 3. That's why I put the 3 right there. So there's my slope of 3. And then I just found out my b was equal to -9. So I substitute in that -9. And you'll notice you'll get the same answer either way you do it. So here's my answer of y equals 3x minus 9. And that would be the equation for that line. On this next problem, on number 3, it says write an equation of line passing through 4 and 3 and parallel to y equals 2x minus 3. So again, you can still use your two different forms. So either form works. So substituting this in, here is my x sub 1, y sub 1. So I'm going to go ahead and substitute in. Here's my 3, goes in place of y sub 1. Here's my 4, it's going to go in place of x sub 1. Now since this is parallel to this line right here, parallel means that they're going to have the same slope. So since they have the same slope, that means that I can just take my slope, which would be this value right here, which is 2, and I can go ahead and substitute it into this equation. So the 4 went here, the 3 went there, and the 2 is my slope. Okay, now finishing this off, it's just a matter of using your distributive property. So distributing this 2 on through, I get 2x minus 8. And once I have that value right there, now I just have to go ahead and finish this off by adding 3 to both sides. So when I add 3 to both sides, I end up with my answer of y equals 2x minus 5. Now if you want to use the other form to solve this problem, again it's just a matter of substitution. So here we have our values we're going to substitute in. So here's my y, here's my slope, here's my x value, substituting those in, and now I have to solve for my y-intercept. That's what I'm missing. So solving for b, I got 2 times 4, which is going to give me 8. Once I have that value there, I can go ahead and subtract the 8 from both sides. So subtracting 8, so 3 minus 8 is going to give me a -5 for my y-intercept. So now notice my slope was parallel, so that's 2. And then I just found my y-intercept, which is -5. And I'm going to go ahead and substitute in those values. So here's my slope, which was 2. Here's my b, which is -5. And you'll see you get the exact same answer. Either form that you want to use, I don't really care which one you use, just make sure you're able to use one of them. And you'd have your equation of y equals 2x minus 5. So that is the conditions for an equation that's passing through 4 and 3, and parallel to the line whose equation is y equals 2x minus 6. So looking at this next problem, so we're looking at number 4. Number 4, the directions say find the midpoint of the line segment whose endpoints are given. You got 4 and 0, and 6 and 3. So when you're finding a midpoint, the easiest way that I remember what a midpoint is I just think of it as an average. An average, you add the two numbers together and divide by that number. And so here we have adding our x's together, divide by 2, and then we're going to add our y's together and divide by 2. So there's your formula. Or if you want to just think of it as an average, and then just reason through it. So now I'm going to go ahead and substitute those numbers into my formula. So substituting those numbers into my formula. So here's my x sub 1, which is 4. Here's my x sub 2, which was 6. I add those together. I got 4 plus 6, and 4 plus 6 is going to give me that value of 10. And then I'm just going to go ahead and divide by 2. So here's 10, divide by 2. And 10 divided by 2 is going to be that x midpoint, which would be 5. Okay, now looking at the y values. So looking at your y values, it says I've got to add my y's together. So adding my y's together. So here's my two y values, 0 and 3. I substitute those in, 0 and 3. And then I'm going to divide by 2. So dividing by 2, I got 0 plus 3 is 3. And 3 divided by 2 is going to give me that answer of 3/2. So your midpoint, when you add those together, it's going to end up being 5 and 3/2. And that looks like that answer matches B on your multiple choice problem. Okay, on this next problem on number 5, so number 5 gives us the directions. It says that we want to go ahead and, it says, write the standard form of the equation of a circle with a given center and radius. So there's two ways of looking at this. So whenever you're thinking the equation of a circle, you can go ahead and remember that the equation of a circle, if you want to write it like this, is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared all equals r squared. Or if you want to, you can just remember it as the Pythagorean theorem. That's what I like to do, and then I just like to think of that as being a shift. So you have your x squared plus y squared all equals r squared. And then I just go ahead and apply the shifts to it. If you want to write that equation out, you're going to notice that within that equation, that h and k would be your center, and that r would be your radius. So again, it's just a matter of substitution. So since you're given the points of -9 and 7, you can just go ahead and substitute that in. So when I substitute this in to this, I get -9. Substitute in, I get 7. And here's my radius, which is 9. I just go ahead and simplify that down. So simplifying that down, I have x minus a minus 9 is going to give me that x plus 9. A minus minus makes it a plus. Just have my y minus 7, and then that all equals 9 squared, which is 81. And so that would give you your equation of your circle that had the center at -9, positive 7, and had a radius of 9. So that looks like that's going to match the answer of D. Okay, now looking at number 6. Number 6 says complete the square and write the equation in standard form and give the center and radius of the circle. So number 6, you've got your equation. It says you have x squared plus y squared minus 4x plus 2y minus 4 all equals 0. So we're going to have to complete the square. So we're going to change number 6 so that it looks like the answer is number 5. So if you take a quick look at what number 5 looked like, we want it to be in this factored form. So in this factored form, it's also called completed the square form, where the x's is factored, the y is being factored, and then you have your radius on the other side. So knowing that, you can kind of start to do that with number 6. So number 6, you're going to want to put your x's next to each other. So here's my x squared minus 4x. You're going to put your y's next to each other. So here's my y squared and plus 2y. And then you're going to want to go ahead and move that number over to the other side. So here's my -4 becomes my +4. Okay, now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and complete the square. So this next step, you're going to go ahead and complete the square. To go ahead and make these so they are factorable. So remember, to complete the square, you take half of b and square it. So 1/2 of the value b and squared. That completes the square. So notice, here's my b value. So I'm going to take half of -4, and I'm going to go ahead and square it. So I'm going to take half of -4, and I square it. So half of -4 is going to be 2. And then 2 squared is 4. So that's the number that makes this entire equation. So it factors down to that perfect square form. So now I can go on to my y value. Here's my 2 again. So just like this -4 was my b value for the x's, this 2 is my b value for my y equation. So now I'm going to take half of 2 and square it. So half of 2 is going to be 1, and 1 squared is going to be 1. So that number goes right there. That's the number that's going to make it so it is factorable. Now, of course, what I do to one side of my equation, so notice I added 4 here. I have to add 4 over here. So notice I still have this 4 from when I moved it over. I'm going to add 4, and now I'm also going to add 1 to both sides. So I have to do what I do to one side of my equation, I have to do to the other side of my equation. So now to finish this one off, I'm going to go ahead and factor those problems right there. So factoring this, so here is this x squared minus 4x plus 4. You're going to know the factors that 4 that add up to be -4 is -2 and -2. So that's going to be, when I factor, that becomes x minus 2 times x minus 2. Or in other words, that's the same thing as x minus 2 squared. Now when I factor this y squared plus 2y plus 1, notice the factors of 1 that add up to be 2 is 1 and 1. So that's going to become y plus 1 times y plus 1. Or in other words, that's the exact same thing as y plus 1 squared. And then when I add the 4 plus the 4 plus the 1, that's going to give me the 9. Okay, now that I've done that, you're going to notice that this is in circle form. So since this is in circle form, I can just go ahead and identify what my center is. So here's x minus 2. That answer would be 2. Here's y plus 1. That answer is going to be -1. And my radius is going to be the square root of 9, which is equal to 3. On problem number 7, it says that we have this equation. It says evaluate the function at the given value of the independent variable and simplify. So if f of x equals -5x plus 2, it wants us to go and find f of 0. So remember, f of 0 is just a matter of substitution. So in place of my x, I'm going to go ahead and substitute in 0. So once I've substituted in 0, it's just a matter of simplifying this. So simplifying this down, you take -5 times 0, which is going to be 0. And you're going to add 2 to that, and 0 plus 2 gives you the answer of 2. So f of 0 is equal to 2 would be the answer to number 7. On the next problem, on number 8, they give us this function. It says that f of x equals, and we have 4x minus 7. It says to find and simplify the difference quotient, f of x plus h minus f of x all over h, and h cannot equal 0 for the given function. So remember, as you look at this entire thing, you've got 2 parts to it. So remember, we can substitute in equations. So that's the first part. We're going to substitute in x plus h into my equation. So when I substitute in that x plus h, I'm going to end up with 4. And then substituting in that x plus h, I get 4 times x plus h minus 7. So f of x plus h means that I can substitute in equations. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and substitute in my f of x. So notice that f of x is equal to 4x minus 7. So in place of f of x, I'm going to put in 4x minus 7. And then that's all going to be divided by h. So simplifying this down now, you're going to remember that if I do it correctly, everything's going to cross out except for those terms that have h in them. So to simplify this, I'm going to go ahead and distribute. So notice to distribute this, I take 4 times x, and that's going to give me this 4x right here. I take 4 times h, that gives me the 4h, and I'm still left with my minus 7. And then I'm going to distribute this negative on through, so this is going to be negative 4x, and a negative times negative 7 is going to be a positive 7. So when I simplify my numerator, I get 4x plus 4h minus 7 minus 4x plus 7. So now I'm going to go ahead and cross out those terms that are alike, and you're going to notice all the terms that don't have the h in them cross out. So 4x minus 4x is going to be 0. Negative 7 plus 7 is 0. And that's just going to go ahead and leave me with this remaining 4h all over h. And now I can go ahead and divide everything by h, cross those out, and my answer comes out to be 4. Okay, on the next problem, on number 9, I've got a piecewise function. So remember, a piecewise function is a function that is made up of 2 or more equations. So it says I've got f of x equals, and I have 2x minus 2, and I've got 4x plus 3. So here's my 2 equations that make up my piecewise function. Now I can't use both those functions to find that value f of negative 5, because if I did, then it would not be a function. So I have to decide which equation to use with a negative 5. And so that brings up these 2 parts right here. This is what's called your domain, or that also known as your criteria. So it says if x is less than negative 2, use that top equation. Then it says if x is greater than negative 2, use that bottom equation. So you're going to notice I wrote in there, it says compare negative 5 to these 2 to see which equation to use. So which equation to use? So negative 5, I check to see is that greater than or equal to negative 2, or is that less than or equal to negative 2? So we know that negative 5 is going to be less than or equal to negative 2. So that means that I'm going to go ahead and use my top equation. So you'll notice I've gone ahead and circled that, and that's why I circled it, because that's the equation I'm going to use. So now I'm going to take negative 5, I'm going to go ahead and substitute it into my equation. So substituting negative 5 into this equation, I've got 2, and then I substitute in my negative 5, so that's 2 times negative 5, and then I still have my minus 2. So after I substitute it in, and I've chose the correct equation to substitute it into, I'm just going to go ahead and simplify that down. So simplifying this down, I've got 2 times negative 5, which gives me this negative 10. I still have to subtract 2, so now subtracting the 2. So negative 10 minus 2 is going to be a negative 12. So that matches with your answer C, which is negative 12. Okay, on this next problem, it just says that it wants me to use the vertical line test to determine whether y is a function of x. So using your vertical line test, remember the vertical line can only intersect that shape in one place for it to be a function. If it intersects it in 2 places, then it is not. So you're going to notice that I drew this line right here to show you that it intersects it in 2 spots. So since it intersects it in 2 places, that answer is no, it is not a function, because it intersected it in 2 places. On this next problem, on number 11, I've got this graph, and it says identify the intervals where the function is changing as requested, and it wants to know where it is increasing at. So you're going to notice that if you look at your graph carefully, you've got this little section right here, and this section is going down. So you remember you always read a graph from left to right. It's going down, so I know that this little section right here would be where my graph is decreasing. And by definition, increasing is where a graph is going up. So this piece of my graph right here would be where it is increasing. So that's why I labeled that as increasing. So that's what I want to go ahead and write as my answer, is that interval from this point to this point is where it's increasing. Now remember, we talked about this, you always have to use x values to write the intervals. So you're looking at your x values. So here's my x value of -2 is where it starts at. And then here's my x value of 2 is where it's going to stop at. So those would be my intervals. And so notice that on my interval, and when you're doing increasing and decreasing intervals, you always use parentheses. So again, it starts here at -2. And it's the x values. And it's going to stop at +2. So that is where your graph is increasing from -2 to 2. So that answer would be C. So that is where it is increasing at. Okay, on this next problem, it wants me to go ahead and find my relative maximum and relative minimum. And you notice I wrote the word maxima and I wrote the word minima. That is just plural of maximums and minimums. So remember that a relative maximum, so it didn't come out very well, but this actually spells, that is what you're looking for is your peaks. So that word is, that K didn't come out very well, but it looks like that is your peak and your valley. So all you have to do is just look at your graph and see where the peaks and the valleys are. So to find your peaks and your valleys on your graph, you just look at your graph, and it looks like it's not on here, so I'm just going to make a quick drawing of my graph on here so that we can see exactly where the peaks and valleys are. So on this graph right here, this is what it looks like. So it goes up to here, then to 2 and 3, to -3. And so this is what my graph is going to look like. That's actually on your review. So as I look at this right here, you're going to notice that it says it wants me to find the relative maxima, the relative minima. So remember, this is, first off, the relative maximum, or relative maximum, that's plural of maximum. So that would be your peaks. So you're going to notice that I do have a peak right here. So that peak right there is located at 0 and 1. So you give the exact location of your peak. And then on this other one, it says that it wants me to find the valleys. So you're going to notice that here's a valley right here. So you just write the location of that valley, and that is located at 2 and -3. So that looks like you have your minimum at 2 and -3, and your maximum at 0 and 1, so that would match A on your multiple choice options. On this next one, it says that we have h of x equals x plus 7 squared plus 6. So to go ahead and graph this, the directions tell us, it says begin by graphing standard quadratic function f of x equals x squared. So here's my graph right here that I drew up. F of x equals x squared. So notice I'm at 0, 0. And there's what my graph looks like. Okay, now it's going to go ahead and move. So remember this first equation. You always have to, everything shifts by the answers. So remember, graphs are going to shift by their roots. So they shift by their answers or their roots. So because they shift by their answers, which is also known as their roots, you have to remember that when you're doing this problem right here, Go ahead and find the answer to x plus 7. And the answer to that is negative 7. And then this is already an answer form, so this is 6. So here I've got the new location of my x squared graph. So I go here to negative 7, and then I go up to 6. And that is where my graph has moved to. So negative 7 and 6, and here's my graph. So that is the answer to number 13, is you just shift that to the left 7 and up 6. Okay, on this next problem, on number 14, they give us our two equations. It says that we have f of x equals 4x minus 7, g of x equals 7x minus 6. It wants me to go ahead and subtract these two equations. So to subtract these two equations, here's my first equation. So I just write it down, 4x minus 7, that is my equation f. And I'm going to subtract my second equation, which is g. So here's my equation g, 7x minus 6. I'm going to subtract that. So here's my g equation. Okay, now I need to go ahead and distribute this negative on through. So as I distribute this negative on through, so here's my first equation. I've just written it down as 4x minus 7. Distributing the negative on through, I get negative 7x. And then a negative times a negative is a positive 6. So now I've got the equation 4x minus 7 minus 7x plus 6. So now I just need to go ahead and combine my like terms. So combining my like terms on this problem, I've got 4x and I've got minus 7x. So I combine those two together. So 4x minus 7x is going to give you this negative 3x. So combining those together, I get negative 3x. Then my other like term that I have is a negative 7 and a positive 6. So I add those two together, combine together, and I'm going to get negative 1. So my answer to that problem is negative 3x minus 1, which matches the answer of B. Okay, on number 15, I've got my two equations again. I've got f of x equals 7 minus 7x. I've got g of x equals negative 4x plus 7. And this time it wants me to go ahead and it wants me to add my two equations together.
Is about over. So if you're not in class,
so I've got f plus g.
Because teachers should be taking roll.
So here's my f equation, 7 minus 7x. Here's my g equation, which is negative 4x plus 7. I'm going to add those two equations together. So here's my f equation. Here's my g equation. And remember, whenever you're adding or subtracting, it's the same thing as just combining like terms. So here's my like term. I've got a negative 7x. I've got a negative 4x. I add those together, and that gives me that negative 11x. And then on this next one, here's my two like terms. I've got a 7. I've got a 7. I add those two together, and that's going to give me that positive 14. So remember, you're just combining your like terms. And so that gives me negative 11x plus 14. So that matches with the answer of B. On the next problem, on number 16, my two equations that it gives me is 17x squared minus 3x. And the second equation that it gives me is 14x minus 4. So it wants me to find f composite g of 3. So there's several ways that you can look at this. The main way that you can look at it is just to go ahead and rewrite it like we wrote them last year. And when you do that, you just kind of push them in together. And so you're going to find f of g of 3. So f of g of 3 means reading from the inside going out, which is what you do for all composites. So the first thing you need to do is you need to take 3 and put it in your equation g. So here's my equation g. I'm going to put 3 inside my equation g and solve it. So here I've got my equation g, which is 14. And then I insert the 3, so I substitute that in, minus 4. So I've substituted in 3 into this equation, and I get 14 times 3 minus 4. So 14 times 3 comes out to be 42, and 42 minus 4 is going to be 38. So g of 3 is 38. So since g of 3 is 38, that means I'm going to take this 38 and put it into my equation f. So putting that into my equation f, so substituting the 38 into my equation f, you're going to notice that. Here's my equation f. So my equation f was, I'll go ahead and write that down again. Looks like my equation f was 17x squared minus 3x. So 17x squared minus 3x was my equation f. So I'm going to put 38 into my equation. So now I end up with 17 times 38 squared minus 3 times 38. So substituting that in. And then at that point, you can just put that in your calculator and take 17 times 38 squared minus 3 times 38. And that'll come out to be 24,434, which matches your equation B. Okay, on number 17, it says we've got our two equations that it gives to us. The two equations that it gives us is f of x equals 4x plus 11 and g of x equals 2x minus 1. And the directions say that it wants us to find f composite g of x. Now remember the way that we wrote these last year? This is the same thing as f of g of x. So if you want to write it like you did back in Algebra 2, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and rewrite that, f composite g of x. So now remember the notation. You always read it from the inside going out. So this means take my equation g and put it in my equation f. So f of g of x, substituting one equation inside of the other. So that means that I'm going to take my g equation, which is this right here, which is 2x minus 1. I'm going to substitute it in to my f equation, which is 4x plus 11. So when I do that, notice the x gets replaced by 2x minus 1. So you're left with 4 times 2x minus 1 plus 11. Now that you've substituted it in, it's just a matter of going ahead and distributing that 4 on through and then simplifying the remaining equation. So when I go ahead and distribute that 4 on through, I'm going to end up with 4 times 2x, which is going to give me this 8x, and 4 times negative 1, which is negative 4. And then I still have my plus 11. So simplifying that down, combining my like terms. So notice my two like terms are negative 4 plus 11. And negative 4 plus 11 is going to give me this answer of 8x plus 7. So that'll be your answer for your composite is 8x plus 7, which is looks like it's answer D. On number 18, the directions say find the average rate of change for the function x sub 1, which equals 2, to x sub 2, which equals 8. So remember the definition of your average rate of change. So whenever I hear the word average rate of change, just remember that's the same thing as your slope. So average rate of change is the exact same thing as slope. So you're going to notice that's the reason why we use the slope formula to find the average rate of change. So here's my slope formula. My slope formula says I got m equals y sub 2 minus y sub 1 all over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. Now the only difference between finding the average rate of change and finding the slope is you're going to notice that on your problem, they only give you your x values. So they give you x sub 1 equals 2, and they give you x sub 2 equals 8. So that means that I actually have to find y sub 1. So to find y sub 1, I have to substitute it into my equation. So notice I substitute in this equation. So that becomes the square root of 2 times 2. And 2 times 2 is 4. And the square root of 4 gives me that 2 right there. So that's my y sub 1 is equal to 2. Now likewise to find y sub 2, it's not given to me, so I have to take my x sub 2, which is 8, Substitute it in, so that's going to give me the square root of 2 times 8. And the square root of 2 times 8 is the square root of 16. And the square root of 16 gives me that 4. And so there's my y sub 2, which equals 4. Now that I have x sub 1, x sub 2, y sub 1, and y sub 2, now it's just actually a matter of substitution. So to substitute those in, just following my formula. If you remember correctly, on your formula, here is your your y sub 2 minus your y sub 1. So here's your y, so y sub 2 minus y sub 1. And then your x sub 2 was 8. And your x sub 1 was 2. Subtracting those, finding that average rate of change or finding the slope, you got 4 minus 2 is going to equal 2. So there's 4 minus 2, that's going to equal 2. And then 8 minus 2 is going to equal 6. Simplifying that down, you're going to divide both top numerator and denominator by 2, simplifying your fraction, and that's going to give you your slope of 1/3. So that matches with answer B, which is it has an average rate of change of 1/3. On number 19, we just want to go ahead and decide whether this is a function or not. So if you remember correctly, functions, all of their domain or their x values are different. So since all their x values, which is their domain, they're all what's called unique. In other words, they are all different. So all I have to do is just check my x values. So this x value is 1, this is 2, this is 6, this is 9, and this is 12. So all of them are all different. So since they're all different, that means that I do have a function. So that answer would be B, which says that you have a function. Now on this last problem, on number 20, it says that we need to go ahead and find the inverse. So to find an inverse, you're going to follow your rules for inverses, and you're going to go ahead and literally switch your x and y function, your x and y variables. So notice step number 1 is you're going to change f of x to y. And the reason why you do that is just for convenience. So you're going to change that f of x to y. Now second step is you're going to literally switch your x and y values. Or in other words, you're switching your domain and your range. And that is the definition of an inverse. The definition is they literally switch their domain and their range, or their x and their y values. So now that I've done that, this leads me to my next step. So my next step is to solve for y. So solving this equation for y, you're going to notice to solve for y, I'm going to go ahead and subtract 7 from both sides. So I get x minus 7, all equals negative 5y. And then I go ahead and divide both sides by negative 5. And when I divide by negative 5, I end up with my inverse function, which is x minus 7 all over negative 5 equals y. So then go ahead and change that y to your new notation of f inverse of x. So f inverse of x equals x minus 7 all over 5, and that matches with the answer of A.